In the spring of 2003, every peach grower in Chilton County, Alabama, pruned the same way. They cut hard in February, opened the canopy wide, chased the big fruit that brought the big prices at the Clanton roadside stands and the Birmingham produce terminals, and they measured a good year by the size of the peaches at the top of the tree where the sun hit first and longest. This was not a theory. It was not an experiment. It was the accumulated weight of 3 generations of men who had figured out what the land and the market wanted from them and had spent their working lives giving it. Chilton County had been peach country since before the Civil War, and the men who farmed it in 2003 carried that history the way they carried everything else, in their hands and in their backs, and in the particular way they walked a row at blossom time, reading the set of the fruit without having to think about it. Let me tell you what that world looked like before Meredith Colquitt changed it, because you need to understand what she was walking into before you can understand what she did. A typical operation in Chilton County in 2003 ran somewhere between 80 and 300 acres of peaches, depending on how much ground a family had managed to hold through the rough years. The trees were mostly Redskin and Contender variety, chosen for their commercial yield and their tolerance of Alabama's unpredictable late frosts. Growers pruned once a year, hard in the dormant season, removing roughly 40 to 50% of the canopy to push energy into the remaining fruiting wood and keep the scaffolding low enough to pick without ladders. It was a system that worked well enough to keep families on their land. Not prosperous in any way that made the farm magazines, but solvent. Year-to-year solvent, which in a business where a single late frost in March could take your entire income, was its own kind of success. The Colquitt farm sat on 210 acres on the south side of the county, 6 miles from the town of Clanton, on ground that Meredith's grandfather had planted in the early 1950s when peach country was expanding east across the state. Her father, Gordon Colquitt, had farmed it since 1978. He was a deliberate man who kept his equipment clean and his pruning records in a red 3-ring binder, and who had never lost a crop to anything that patience and a weather radio couldn't have told him was coming. He ran 140 acres of peaches and leased the remaining ground to a neighbor for soybeans. His average yield ran about 250 bushels per acre in a good year, which put him in the middle third of county producers, and which he considered adequate. Gordon Colquitt was a man who trusted the middle of distributions. He had seen enough outliers, high and low, to understand that the middle was where you built a life. Let me tell you about Meredith Colquitt, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from the people around her in a way that took those people a long time to see clearly. Meredith was 47 years old in the spring of 2003. She had not gone away to university. She had not come back with a degree and a notebook full of research citations, the way the characters in simpler versions of this kind of story tend to do. She had stayed. She had worked the farm through her 20s and her 30s alongside her father, and she had learned everything she knew about peach production from the same sources Gordon had learned it: the county extension office, the Alabama Cooperative Extension System publications, the Chilton County Peach Association meetings held every January in the fellowship hall of the First Baptist Church in Clanton. But Meredith had been reading. Not research papers, though she had read some of those too. She had been reading about orchards in Georgia and South Carolina and California, about the shift happening in commercial peach production toward what the trade publications were starting to call high-density planting systems, and she had been watching her own trees. She had a habit her father did not share, which was walking the orchard in the evenings after supper, not to check for disease or count the fruit set, but just to look. She had been doing it since she was a teenager, and in 30 years of evening walks, she had built up a picture of her trees that was different from the picture in Gordon's red binder. She had noticed which rows consistently outperformed and which consistently underperformed. She had noticed the relationship between the afternoon shade pattern from the tree line along the south fence and the fruit size in the rows nearest it. She had noticed that the trees she and her father had replaced after a 1996 ice storm, younger trees on a different rootstock, were now at 10 years old, showing a per-tree yield that was running 20% above the mature trees of the same variety planted 30 years earlier. She had written these observations down, not in a formal notebook. On the backs of the pruning records in the red binder, in the margins of the extension publication, stacked on the mudroom shelf, on the notepad by the kitchen phone, where she had always jotted things she didn't want to forget. The observations were scattered across 15 years of her life in a dozen different places. But they added up to something. What they added up to was this: the Colquitt Farms pruning system, the same system used on every comparable operation in Chilton County, was producing good fruit at the top of the canopy and mediocre fruit everywhere else, and the mediocre fruit was the majority of the crop. The hard annual pruning that everyone knew was correct was concentrating sunlight and energy at the expense of the interior wood, and the interior wood was where most of the tree's potential yield lived. If you could get more light into the interior of the canopy, not by reducing the pruning, but by changing the geometry of it, you could, in theory, improve the quality and size distribution of the fruit across the entire tree rather than just the top third. This was not a new idea in the literature. There was a body of work out of the University of California, and from researchers in northern Italy's South Tyrol region, the most productive peach and apple country in Europe, showing that canopy architecture had measurable effects on fruit quality indices: sugar content, firmness, color development, size uniformity. The Italians especially had been experimenting with training systems that kept tree height lower and canopy geometry more open to diffuse light rather than direct overhead light. Their numbers showed improvements in pack-out rates, the percentage of fruit grading at premium size of 15 to 25% compared to conventional pruning systems on the same varieties. Meredith had priced what a conversion would cost: new training stakes, adjustment to the pruning contract she had with the crew that came every February, a season of reduced yield while the canopy restructured. The total investment for the 40 acres she was considering, the block of contender trees along the east side of the property, 12 years old, healthy root systems, good irrigation coverage, came to roughly $18,000 spread over 2 seasons. If the Italian research held on Alabama ground, and on these varieties, the improvement in pack-out rate alone would recover that investment in the 3rd year. She brought this to the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening in October of 2002. Gordon Colquitt listened to his daughter for 20 minutes. He looked at the papers she had printed from the University Extension database. He looked at the photograph she had found of a South Tyrol orchard with its low, wide-spreading canopy and its scaffolding of horizontal wire. He set his coffee cup down about halfway through and didn't pick it up again. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Gordon said, "Where is this working in Alabama?" Meredith said, "It isn't yet." Gordon looked at the photograph again. "South Tyrol," he said. "That's Italy. It's working in California, too. Stone fruit operations in the San Joaquin, California," he said, with the particular tone that Alabama farmers reserve for California, which is not quite dismissal and not quite respect, but something in between. He thought about it. Not for 2 weeks, for about 30 seconds. Then he said, "You can have the contender block, 40 acres, 1 season. But I want the numbers in writing before you touch the February pruning." Meredith said that was fine. She had the numbers ready before Christmas. Now let me tell you about the man who made sure that as many people in Chilton County as possible knew about Gordon Colquitt's daughter and her Italian orchard ideas, because this kind of story always has a man like this, and it is worth paying careful attention to why. His name was Lester Prudhomme. He was 61 years old in 2003, and he had run Prudhomme Ag Services out of a metal building on Highway 31 north of Clanton for the past 22 years. Prudhomme Ag Services did pruning contracts, equipment rental, and spray applications for most of the mid-size peach operations in the county, and Lester Prudhomme had been inside more Chilton County orchards in the past 2 decades than the county extension agent had visited in his entire career. He was not a formally educated man. He was a profoundly experienced one, and there is a difference, and both kinds of knowledge have their value. And one of the things that experience cannot always tell you is where its own limits are. Lester held the pruning contract on the Colquitt farm. He had held it for 11 years. He showed up every February with 2 crews and took the canopy down the way it had always come down, and Gordon Colquitt paid him, and they talked about the weather and the price outlook, and he drove back down the county road. Meredith came to see him in November of 2002, before the season, to explain what she wanted to do differently on the contender block. She was professional about it. She brought the papers. She sat across from him at the plywood desk in his metal building with the space heater. She walked him through the canopy geometry, the light distribution data, the pack-out projections. She was not asking his permission. She was asking him whether his crews could execute the cuts she needed, because the cuts were different from what they had been doing, and she respected his people's skill enough to want them involved. Lester listened. Then he looked at the papers for a moment and looked back at her. "Meredith," he said, and he said her name the way a man says a name when he has decided in advance that what comes next is generous advice rather than an argument. "I have pruned peach trees in this county for 22 years. I have seen growers try new systems. I have seen them spend money on Italian ideas and California ideas and university ideas, and I have watched those trees come back looking like they were pruned by someone who had never seen a peach orchard." He shook his head. "You open up that interior wood the way you're describing, and you're going to have sun scald on the scaffold limbs before July and water sprout growth you cannot control. That canopy geometry works in South Tyrol because the sunlight angle is different. We're at 32 degrees north latitude. It's not the same." Meredith looked at him. "The California work was done at 36 degrees, she said. "Some of the San Joaquin operations are closer to our latitude than South Tyrol is." Lester leaned back in his chair. "I'll tell you what I think," he said. "I think you're going to spend $18,000 to find out what your daddy already knows." Meredith looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Can your crew do the cuts I need?" Lester said he supposed they could. She drove her back to the farm. "Now, let me ask you to sit with that conversation for a moment before we go any further, because Lester Prudhomme was not wrong about everything. He was not wrong that well-intentioned growers had spent money on imported systems that didn't translate to Alabama conditions. He was not wrong that sun scald was a real risk with improperly opened canopies. What he was wrong about was the assumption underneath his argument. The assumption that because he had not seen this system work in Chilton County, it could not work in Chilton County. The absence of a local example is not the same as evidence against. Lester Prudhomme had 22 years of experience with one method. He had 0 years of experience with the alternative. Those are not equivalent data sets, and he was treating them as though they were. Meredith Colquitt knew the difference. Lester Prudhomme did not. Not yet. Let me tell you about the spring and summer of 2003, because that first season on the contender block is where the story begins to move. Meredith supervised the February pruning herself, cut by cut on the first dozen trees until Lester's lead man, a quiet Guatemalan-born pruner named Hector, who had been doing this work since 1994 and who could read a tree the way a carpenter reads grain in wood, understood what she was after and started making the decisions himself. By the third day, Hector was ahead of her. He had internalized the geometry. Lower the center leader, spread the scaffold branches on a wider angle, cut to outward-facing buds to push growth away from the canopy interior, and he was executing it faster and more consistently than she had expected. She wrote that down. The pruning cost ran 14% higher than the conventional block because the cuts took more judgment and more time per tree. She had budgeted for this. By mid-April, when the fruit set had finished and she could walk the rows and count, the contender block was carrying a crop that was distributed differently from anything she had managed before. The fruit was not concentrated in the top third of the canopy. It was coming in across the whole tree. Upper scaffold, mid-saffold, inner lateral wood that the conventional pruning system would have removed entirely. The set was heavier than the conventional block on a per-limb basis. She did not celebrate this. She had seen fruit set before, and she knew that set was not crop. She wrote it down and kept walking. The first thing she noticed by June was the color development in the interior fruit. On a conventionally pruned contender tree, the fruit in the lower and interior canopy typically runs a week to 10 days behind the upper fruit in color development because it receives less direct sunlight. In the restructured canopy, the interior fruit was coloring within 4 days of the upper fruit. She measured it with the color chart from the extension office, the same chart the packing house used for grading. She photographed the fruit at 2-week intervals. She kept the photographs in a manila folder with the dates on the back. The second thing she noticed, in mid-July, was the size distribution. A peach that grades at premium size in Alabama, large, what the packing houses call 56 count, meaning 56 fruit to a bushel, is worth roughly $1.10 per pound at the terminal market in 2003. A peach that grades at standard size is worth 60 cents. A peach that falls below standard goes to the processors at 22 cents. The gap between a good pack-out and a poor one, on 40 acres of trees carrying a full crop, is not a small difference. It is the difference between a year that pays for itself and a year that doesn't. In the second week of July, Meredith walked the contender block with a set of sizing rings. She walked a comparable section of the conventional block on the same day. In the restructured trees, 67% of the fruit she sized was running at 56 count or larger. In the conventional block, 48% was reaching that grade. The remaining fruit, in the conventional block, was distributing heavily into the standard and below standard categories. She did not go to Lester Prudhomme with these numbers. She did not go to the Peach Association meeting in August and announce anything. She finished the season. She watched the sunscald that Lester had predicted. She found it on 4 trees in the southeast corner of the block where an equipment lane had created an unusual exposure. 4 trees out of the 340 in the block. She noted it. She knew how to address it in the following season's pruning. In October, when the harvest was done and the packing house settlement sheets came back, she sat at the kitchen table with Gordon and went through them. The contender block, 40 acres, had packed out at 61% premium grade. The conventional blocks on comparable ground and variety had packed out at 46% premium. Her yield in bushels per acre was within 3% of the conventional block. She had not improved total yield meaningfully in year 1, which she had expected. What she had improved was value per bushel. At 2003 terminal prices, The restructured block had generated $4,200 more per acre in gross revenue than the conventional ground. On 40 acres, that was $168,000 in additional revenue above what the same acreage had produced the year before, from the same trees, on the same soil, with the same irrigation, in the same weather. She put the settlement sheets on the table and waited. Gordon looked at the numbers for a long time. He looked at the packing house grade breakdown. He picked up the sheet with the per-acre comparison and held it under the kitchen light. Then he set it down. "You were right," he said. He said it the way men of his generation say things like that, not loudly, not with any additional words attached. He said it, and then he was quiet. But after supper, instead of going to the living room the way he usually did, he stayed at the table and asked her to walk him through the canopy geometry again from the first cut. They sat there past 9 o'clock. When Meredith went to bed, she could hear him in the mudroom, where he kept the red binder, opening it, turning pages. He gave her the rest of the farm in the spring of 2004. Let me tell you about what happened next, because the contender block was the proof. But the rest of the farm was where the story became something that outlasted the Colquitt property line. Converting 100 additional acres of mature peach trees to the restructured canopy system over 2 seasons required a level of execution that could not come entirely from Meredith walking row by row. It required Hector's crew to have internalized the approach deeply enough to maintain it without constant supervision, and it required Gordon to stop second-guessing the cuts he was watching from the equipment lane, which, to his credit, took him about 1 afternoon. By the second week of the conversion pruning, Gordon was standing at the end of rows, watching the crew work with the same look he got when he watched someone do something correctly that he had once done poorly. The particular expression of a man revising a long-held opinion in real time. By midsummer of 2004, the pack-out data from the newly converted blocks was running consistent with the contender results from the prior year. Not identical, different tree age, different microclimate in the north block, one row of redskin trees that showed resistance to the geometry change that Meredith had not anticipated and had to adjust for. But the trend line was clear. The overall farm pack-out in the 2004 harvest settlement was 58% premium grade. The Chilton County average, published by the Peach Association in their annual report, was 44%. Revenue per acre on the Colquitt farm in 2004 ran 31% above the county average. Gordon Colquitt looked at the county comparison figure in the Peach Association report and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "I think you should write this up for Paul Briggs at the Extension office." Meredith said she would think about it. She thought about it for 2 months. Then she called Paul Briggs. Now let me tell you about the late frost season of 2005, because that season is the reason people still talk about the Colquitt farm at the Peach Association meetings, and because it is the moment when the conversation that had been running quietly through Chilton County for 2 years came to a point that nobody could soften. The frost of April 9, 2005 arrived 11 days after the Chilton County average last frost date, which is late enough to catch a fully bloomed peach orchard without any reasonable defenses. Temperatures dropped to 26 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 hours, reaching the minimum threshold for embryo kill in an open peach blossom, and they stayed below 28 degrees for 6 hours. Long enough to damage partially hardened fruitlets that had set in the warmer days of late March. Every grower in the county was running frost protection equipment that night, overhead irrigation, wind machines, heaters in the older operations that still had them. You do what you can. In a severe spring frost with a full blossom crop, what you can do is often not enough. The county took the frost hard. The Extension Office estimated a 60 to 70% crop loss across conventional Chilton County peach operations. Growers who had been planning on a full harvest were looking at thin pickings, spot harvest in the most protected low spots, and a thin September with the bills still due. Meredith's restructured trees lost fruit, too. She did not come through untouched. The frost was real, and the farm felt it. But the canopy geometry that the restructured system created had a characteristic that became important on the morning of April 10th. The lower, more open scaffolding had allowed the frost protection irrigation to reach the mid-canopy fruit without the upper branches shedding water away from the interior before it could form the protective ice shell. In the conventional blocks, upper branches dripped water onto lower branches below, but the heavier wood and tighter geometry meant that ice formed unevenly. In the restructured blocks, the more uniform architecture let the ice layer develop with better consistency across the whole canopy. She had not designed this. It was a consequence of the geometry she had designed for light distribution, and it showed up as a frost protection benefit she had not anticipated. Her fruit loss on the restructured blocks ran at 38%. The county average was 63%. She called Lester Prudhomme's office that afternoon to discuss the following season's pruning schedule. His receptionist told her he was out at the Whitmore operation on County Road 42, assessing frost damage. She left a message. Lester called her back 2 days later. She gave him the loss figure. He was quiet on the phone for a moment. 38%, he said. 38, she said. He was quiet again. I've got 6 growers calling me this week, he said, all of them asking about the canopy system. After what Briggs put in the newsletter last January, and now after this. He paused. I don't know what to tell them. Tell them it takes 2 seasons to convert a mature block, Meredith said. The first season you're restructuring. The second season the tree is adapting. You don't see the full pack-out improvement until year 3. I told you in 2002 you'd get sons called, Lester said. I had 4 trees, Meredith said. Southeast corner of the contender block. Unusual exposure? I adjusted the scaffold angle on those trees the following. No recurrence. Lester was quiet for a moment. I knew this county's orchards for 22 years, he said. I didn't know they could do this. They've always been able to, Meredith said. They just needed the pruning system to let them. There was a pause on the line, not an uncomfortable one. The pause of a man absorbing something he has been moving toward for a while and has finally arrived at. The 6 growers, Lester said. Could I bring them out to the farm? Yes, Meredith said, I can do that. Let me tell you about the years that followed that phone call, because the frost of 2005 was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different chapter. By the spring of 2006, Meredith was running the restructured canopy system on all 140 acres of Colquitt peaches, carrying an average pack-out rate that Paul Briggs calculated at 34% above the county average over 3 consecutive seasons. Gordon had fully stepped back from the pruning decisions by then, not because he was told to, but because somewhere in the winter of 2004, he had arrived at the understanding that his daughter could read an orchard the way he had never learned to read one, and that the correct thing to do with that understanding was to get out of the way and see what she built. What she built was considerable. The farm's gross revenue per acre in 2006 ran 41% above the 2002 baseline in real terms. The packing house they worked with, a mid-size operation in Clanton that handled fruit from about 60 county growers, started routing buyers specifically to the Colquitt fruit. Not because of any marketing effort on Meredith's part. She had not called anyone, had not taken out an advertisement, had not attended a trade show. Because the settlement sheets were consistent and the pack-out rate was consistent, and in a business where consistency is the rarest quality, consistent growers attract buyers the way a well-maintained barn attracts good tenants. The 6 growers Lester Prudham brought to the farm in the spring of 2005 spent most of an afternoon walking rows with Meredith. She showed them the canopy geometry, explained the cut sequence, answered questions about sun-scald risks and water sprout management, and the difference in pruning crew time the system required. She did not oversell it. She showed them her settlement sheets, which she had brought to the kitchen table for the occasion, and she let the numbers do the talking that she preferred not to do herself. All 6 converted at least a portion of their acreage that winter. By 2007, 18 peach operations in Chilton County were running some version of the restructured canopy system. By 2009, that number was 31. The Peach Association asked Meredith to present at the January meeting in 2008. She stood at the podium in the Fellowship Hall of First Baptist in Clanton and talked for 45 minutes about canopy geometry and light distribution and pack-out economics. And when she was done, the questions from the floor ran for another hour. The association president, a third-generation grower named Boyd Halverson, who had been skeptical of Meredith's approach in the conversations around the coffee table for the past 4 years, stood up at the end and said that the data spoke for itself. He said it without irony and with the particular straightforwardness of a man who has been waiting to find an appropriate way to change his position and has finally been handed one. Gordon Colquitt was in the back of the room. He had come without telling Meredith he was coming, had driven himself the 6 miles from the farm, and sat in the last row in his good jacket and listened to his daughter for 45 minutes and then listened to the questions. When the room started breaking up, a man sitting next to him introduced himself as a grower from the east side of the county and said he had heard about the Colquitt operation and asked Gordon what it had been like watching the conversion happen from the beginning. Gordon said it had been the most instructive experience of his farming life. He said, nothing more than that. But the man from the east side of the county who had asked the question said later that the way Gordon Colquitt said it left no room for any other interpretation. Let me tell you about the evening in February of 2011 that stays with Meredith most, because the story has one more turn, and it happens quietly, at the kitchen table, the way the important things on this farm have always happened. Meredith was 55 years old. She had been managing the Colquitt operation for 8 years by then, with Gordon in the role he was best suited for, which was sitting on the porch in the morning and drinking coffee and watching the tree line and occasionally saying something that turned out to be useful. The farm was producing at levels that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had walked it in 2002. Pack-out rates holding above 60% premium for 3 consecutive seasons. Soil health data improving steadily through the cover crop system she had added to the inter-row management in 2007. A working relationship with Hector's crew. Hector himself now ran his own small pruning operation. Meredith, his first and longest client, built on enough mutual fluency that she could describe what she wanted in a canopy, and he could execute it without either of them having to find many words. That February evening, her daughter Iris, who was 24, and had been working the harvest side of the operation since finishing her agronomy degree at Auburn 2 years prior, came to the kitchen table after supper with a stack of research articles and a laptop and a look on her face that Meredith recognized because she had worn it herself. The articles were about precision irrigation, variable rate drip systems that used soil moisture sensors at multiple depths to modulate water delivery block by block, responding to actual soil conditions rather than scheduled timing. Research from UC Davis and from a long-term trial at a Georgia peach operation showed water use reductions of 22 to 30% with yield maintenance, and in one case, yield improvement through more precise delivery during the critical sizing period in early summer. Iris slid the laptop across the table. She had already priced the sensor installation for the contender block. Meredith looked at the screen. She looked at her daughter. She thought about a kitchen table in October of 2002 and a set of packing house settlement sheets, and a father who had said, "You can have the contender block," with the measured generosity of a man deciding to let evidence speak before opinion. She thought about walking the rows in the evenings, about Hector reading a tree the way a carpenter reads grain, about the frost of April 9th, 2005, and 38%, and the 6 phone calls that came after. She looked at the laptop for a moment. Then she looked up at Iris and said, "Show me the sensor placement diagram." She did not ask for time to think it over. Gordon was at the table. He had heard the whole exchange. He picked up one of the research articles and read the first page in the particular way he read things now, slower than he used to, more carefully, as though he had learned that reading carefully was a skill he should have developed earlier and intended to practice as much of it as remained to him. He set the article down. He said nothing immediately, but Meredith saw him reach across the table and pull Iris's laptop closer to him, and she saw him put on his reading glasses, and she saw him lean in toward the screen. Lester Prudhomme retired in 2012. He had converted his own company's pruning methodology to the restructured canopy approach in 2006, the year after the frost, and by the time he retired, every crew he ran had been trained in the geometry Meredith had walked him through in the spring of 2005. At his retirement dinner at the Clanton Elks Lodge, he gave a short speech in which he said that the most useful thing he had learned in 29 years of this work was that the experience that makes you confident is often the experience that makes you wrong. He did not name Meredith Colquitt. He did not need to. The contender block on the south side of the Colquitt farm still runs on the restructured canopy system. So does every other block. The pack-out rate across the farm has held above 60% premium for 6 consecutive seasons, which the Peach Association calls exceptional for this part of Alabama. Meredith Colquitt still walks the rows in the evenings. Not every evening the way she did when she was younger, but most of them in the growing season. She still carries a notepad, not the manila folder with the pruning photographs from 2003, which is stored in the mudroom on the shelf where Gordon used to keep the red binder. The red binder is there too, his handwriting and hers. Different systems, same shelf, same farm, same ground that gave them both what they were willing to ask of it. Iris runs the irrigation program now. The sensors went in on schedule. The water use data from the first full season came back in October, and Meredith put it on the kitchen table the same way her settlement sheets had been put on that table years before. Gordon read it in his good reading glasses and said the numbers were better than he had expected. Iris said she had expected them. Gordon looked at his granddaughter across the table for a moment. Then he looked at Meredith. He nodded once, the nod of a man who has learned, across the long and humbling arc of a life spent watching the same ground, that the most reliable farming he has ever witnessed has always started with someone paying close attention and being unwilling to mistake familiarity for knowledge. The pruning crew comes in February. The trees carry what the trees are asked to carry. The evenings are long enough in late July to walk every row before dark. If you start right after supper and keep moving, Meredith keeps moving.